Have you ever stopped to think about what really happens after death? What if everything we were taught about the afterlife had been carefully shaped to keep us in check? The Apocalypse of Peter, an ancient text that describes hell in terrifying detail and suggests the possibility of forgiveness even for the damned, presents a vision so radical that it was excluded from the Bible and relegated to oblivion. But why did the church consider it too dangerous to read? Imagine a text that challenges the notion of eternal damnation, that exposes a hell so vivid that it surpasses any traditional description, and that even suggests that God, in the end, may be more compassionate than we have been led to believe. This text existed and circulated widely in the first centuries of Christianity. However, in a deliberate move, it was suppressed to make way for more convenient narratives aligned with the consolidation of ecclesiastical power. Today, we will delve into the depths of this forbidden revelation. Let's explore why his graphic descriptions of hell, his promise of mercy, and his connections to pagan myths were considered too dangerous. Prepare to question everything you thought you knew about the afterlife, the role of the church, and the true essence of divine justice. But before we start, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any content about this hidden knowledge that defies centuries of official history. Imagine a scenario so disturbing that just hearing it described makes you begin to question the idea of divine justice. In Peter's Apocalypse, we are presented with a hell that seems more like a theater of horrors. Sinners suspended over eternal fire, devoured by incessant worms or immersed in rivers of torment. Unlike canonical texts, this gospel is not concerned with softening the consequences of sin. It gets straight to the point, detailing each punishment with an almost macabre realism. But why did the church, with all its interest in controlling through fear, exclude this text from its official collection? The answer may lie in the intensity of the descriptions themselves. The Apocalypse of Peter presents a hell so vivid and extreme that it could trigger chaotic interpretations among the faithful. It is a view that, if popularized, could undermine the church-centered narrative of redemption. After all, why worry about the salvation offered by the sacraments if the afterlife destiny already seems sealed and immutable? This type of perspective could alienate believers instead of keeping them within ecclesiastical control, creating a practical problem for the institution. Interestingly, this text also gives us an idea of what the early church considered too dangerous. While other works focused on stories of redemption and hope, the Apocalypse of Peter became a kind of spiritual horror movie appealing directly to fear. Although this type of narrative was effective in frightening the faithful, it also opened the door to questions about divine justice. What happens, for example, to believers who err out of ignorance? This ambiguity may have been another reason for exclusion. What we cannot ignore is that these graphic images of hell did not appear out of nowhere. Many elements described in the Apocalypse of Peter echo earlier traditions, such as Greek Tartarus and Egyptian punishments in the afterlife. This suggests that hell, as we understand it, may have been constructed from pre-Christian mythologies, adapted to attract and control converts from different cultures. In rejecting the Apocalypse of Peter, the church perhaps sought a more universal and less risky approach to sustaining its power. But this exclusion raises an intriguing question. Was the hell described in this text really a divine revelation, or a carefully crafted tool to enforce obedience? And more, was the church prepared to deal with the theological implications of a God who allowed such horrors? The next topic introduces us to an even more controversial idea: the possibility that even the damned can find mercy. Among the most surprising passages in the Apocalypse of Peter is one that directly challenges one of the most steadfast pillars of traditional Christianity: eternal damnation. In an unexpected passage, the text suggests that God can offer mercy even to those damned in hell, allowing them to eventually find redemption. This idea sounds like a theological bombshell, calling into question the dogma that has sustained centuries of control through fear. After all, if even the lost can be forgiven, what would be the real power of the threat of hell? The possibility of redemption for the condemned contrasts with the rigid narrative that the Church has institutionalized. For centuries, hell has been used as a tool to ensure the obedience of the faithful and keep the masses dependent on the rituals and sacraments offered by the Church. The idea of eternal punishment was convenient. An irrevocable destiny reinforced the need for conformity here and now. The Apocalypse of Peter, by introducing divine mercy as something that transcends even hell, destabilizes this balance and suggests a God who is more compassionate than vengeful. This view also sheds light on the theological disputes of the first centuries of Christianity. Some currents, such as universalism, argued that salvation was an inevitable destiny for all creation, while others emphasized God's relentless justice. The Apocalypse of Peter seems to flirt with both ideas, presenting a God who is capable of severely punishing, but also of forgiving. This duality may have made the text too uncomfortable to be accepted as canon, especially at a time when the Church sought to consolidate its authority. But what makes this idea even more fascinating is the way it dialogues with spiritual concepts from other traditions. In Hinduism, for example, reincarnation offers multiple chances for spiritual evolution. In Buddhism, the cycle of samsara allows for the continuous search for enlightenment. The revelation of Peter seems to touch on something similar, suggesting that the soul's journey does not end in hell, but continues toward a higher destination. Was this view simply too advanced for early Christianity? And so, we are faced with a disturbing question. Why has the Church chosen to suppress this more merciful view of God? Would a God who forgives even the damned be less effective in inspiring obedience than a God who eternally condemns? These reflections lead us to explore why the Apocalypse of Peter was discarded in favor of another apocalyptic text more aligned with the interests of the Church, the Apocalypse of John. It is curious to think that, at a certain point, the Apocalypse of Peter circulated widely among the first Christians and was cited as a valid reading by respected figures, such as Clement of Alexandria. However, it was eventually discarded in favor of the Apocalypse of John, which became the official book on the final judgment. Why? The answer seems to lie in politics and power. While Peter's text delves into graphic detail and a complex vision of divine mercy, John's revelation offers a coded message against the Roman Empire, aligned with the Church's interests in consolidating its position in a world dominated by imperial politics. The revelation of John, with its symbolic language and emphasis on Christ's triumph over evil, is perfectly shaped to inspire resilience and hope in times of persecution. His narrative of final victory was most useful in uniting Christians against their oppressors. In contrast, Peter's Apocalypse, with its explicit descriptions of hell and its idea of mercy for the damned, could generate more doubts than certainties among the faithful. At a time of identity formation, the Church needed texts that reinforced its authority, not that called it into question. Furthermore, the revelation of John presents a clear vision of judgment. The righteous will be saved, and the wicked will be condemned. This simple separation served to create a clear distinction between us and them, reinforcing the Church's role as a guide to salvation. The Apocalypse of Peter, with its emphasis on the possibility of forgiveness even for the condemned, undermined this duality. After all, if even the lost can be redeemed, what would be the role of the Church in mediating salvation? Another important factor is the tone of the two texts. While John uses grand images and symbols that can be interpreted in different ways, Peter gets straight to the point, describing specific and painful punishments. This graphic, almost didactic approach could be seen as a double-edged sword. It was useful for terrifying the faithful, but it also ran the risk of appearing exaggerated or even contradictory to the idea of a just God. The Church, in choosing the Apocalypse of John, bet on a text that offered more interpretative flexibility and less chance of theological controversy. Replacing the Apocalypse of Peter with that of John was not just a theological choice. It was a strategic decision. It reflects the priorities of a church that sought to consolidate its control, construct a uniform narrative, and align its teachings with the political interests of the time. But did this movement erase a more authentic vision of early Christianity? This question leads us to the next topic, where we delve into Peter's graphic descriptions of hell and question whether they were more than just images of horror. The descriptions of hell in the Apocalypse of Peter are so vivid that they could easily appear in a horror movie script. Imagine sinners being suspended over eternal flames, devoured by worms, or plunged into rivers of endless suffering. These details, as graphic as they are unsettling, seem designed to leave an indelible mark on the mind of whoever reads them. But the question that arises is, were these images divine revelations or intentionally created to provoke fear? The terror described in the text is not just about the afterlife, but also about control in the here and now. The intensity of these images suggests a clear purpose: to ensure the obedience of the faithful. The fear of hell has always been one of the most powerful tools of organized religion, and the Apocalypse of Peter seems to take this strategy to the extreme. By describing suffering in such specific detail, the text creates a psychological impact that goes beyond logic and directly affects emotions. Who, upon hearing these descriptions, would dare challenge the morality imposed by the church? However, there is also a risk that this graphic approach would sound exaggerated or even contradictory to the idea of a compassionate God. Interestingly, these descriptions have parallels in other cultures. Greek Tartarus, for example, presented equally terrible punishments for those who defied the gods. In Egypt, the duet depicted the judgment and punishments of souls in similar detail. This suggests that the hell of Peter's apocalypse did not appear out of nowhere, but was influenced by pre-Christian myths adapted to align with the Christian narrative. The intention may have been to create a concept of hell that would be familiar to converts coming from these traditions, but that would also reinforce the exclusivity of the Christian faith. But why, then, did the church decide to reject the Apocalypse of Peter, even with its clear impact? Perhaps because his description of hell was so explicit that it got out of control. It's one thing to use fear as a tool. Another is to let it take on a life of its own, creating extreme interpretations, or worse, discouraging adherence to Christianity because it seems excessively punitive. By choosing less graphic texts, such as the Apocalypse of John, the church maintained the power to control the narrative of the final judgment without going overboard. This decision, however, leaves us with an unsettling reflection. How has fear been shaped and used to maintain religious power throughout history? Did the terrifying images of Peter's revelation reveal more about humanity than about the divine? And what about the connections to pagan mythologies that inspired these visions? These questions lead us to the next topic, where we explore the direct influences of ancient cultures on the construction of Christian hell. If we analyze the descriptions of hell in the Apocalypse of Peter, it is impossible to ignore the similarities with pagan myths that preceded Christianity. Tartarus, for example, is a region of the Greek underworld where sinners suffer eternal torment for defying the gods. Likewise, the Egyptian duat presented an afterlife scenario filled with specific punishments for different types of transgressions. In the Revelation of Peter, we find echoes of these traditions, with sinners being suspended, burned, or devoured, images that seem more mythological than spiritual. Could it be that Christian hell is actually an adaptation of these ancient narratives? The connection with Greek mythologies is particularly notable. Tartarus was a powerful tool of social control in Hellenic culture, a place reserved for the greatest transgressors. Like the Titans who defied Zeus, this idea of a specific location for eternal punishment was widely assimilated by the first Christian communities, who adapted the concept to consolidate their own doctrines. It is no coincidence that the descriptions in the Revelation of Peter are so detailed. They speak directly to the popular imagination, using language that was already familiar to many pagan converts. But early Christianity also incorporated elements of the Egyptian duat, where the judgment of souls was carried out by Osiris and his divine advisors. The punishments described in this context were deeply symbolic, reflecting sins committed in life. In the revelation of Peter, we see a similar adaptation, where each punishment is directly related to the transgression committed. This approach not only reinforces the idea of divine justice, but also connects Christianity to a universal tradition of after-death spirituality, making its message more accessible and impactful. The interesting thing is how these influences were used strategically. By absorbing concepts from Tartarus and Duat, Christianity created a hell that not only terrified, but also legitimized its doomsday narrative. This was especially useful at a time when the church was competing for converts in a world full of established religious traditions. Incorporating pagan elements gave Christianity an advantage, allowing it to present itself as a continuity and, at the same time, an overcoming of these beliefs. But this assimilation also raises uncomfortable questions. To what extent is the Christian concept of hell really a divine revelation? Could it be that he was shaped more by the need to conquer and control than by spiritual truth? These questions lead us to an even deeper reflection on the role of Jesus in this scenario. Is he portrayed in the revelation of Peter as a compassionate deliverer or as a ruthless judge? In 1886, in Akhmim, Egypt, archaeologists made a discovery that challenged centuries of settled doctrine. A manuscript containing the Apocalypse of Peter, a text long thought lost. This codex, preserved in the silence of the desert, was one of the most tangible evidence that certain early Christian narratives were not just set aside, but actively suppressed. The fact that the text disappeared for so long and only resurfaced almost 2,000 years later raises intriguing questions. What else was hidden, and why? The Apocalypse of Peter was already known by ancient scholars, such as Clement of Alexandria, who mentioned it as a valid reading. However, it disappeared from public hands, probably during the first centuries of Christianity, when the biblical canon was being formed. This disappearance does not appear to be a coincidence. The message of the text, with its graphic descriptions of hell and the suggestion that even the damned could be forgiven, was too uncomfortable for the official narrative the church was constructing. The discovery of Akhmim's codex was not just an archaeological find. It was a reminder that early Christianity was much more diverse than the canon suggests. Texts like the Apocalypse of Peter offer a window into a time when different perspectives coexisted and competed for space. However, as the church became institutionalized, it needed a unified narrative that reinforced its authority. Texts that presented complex ideas or contradictions, such as the Apocalypse of Peter, were silently relegated to oblivion. What makes this discovery even more significant is the archaeological context, found alongside other texts that were also excluded from the canon. The Apocalypse of Peter is part of a collection that directly challenges the decisions made by the councils of the early church. These texts reveal a struggle for power and control that is often forgotten in the official history of Christianity. The re-emergence of this manuscript brings into focus the role of the church in shaping the spiritual narrative to suit its political and theological interests. Akhmim's discovery not only reignites interest in the Apocalypse of Peter, but also raises questions about what else may be hidden. How many other texts were deliberately suppressed because they did not align with the convenience of the moment? And what could these texts teach us about early Christianity and its internal struggles? If you like this content and want to continue exploring forbidden knowledge and hidden stories of humanity, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Until the next video. In 1886, in Akhmim, Egypt, archaeologists made a discovery that challenged centuries of settled doctrine. A manuscript containing the Apocalypse of Peter, a text long thought lost. This codex, preserved in the silence of the desert, was one of the most tangible evidence that certain early Christian narratives were not just set aside, but actively suppressed. The fact that the text disappeared for so long and only resurfaced almost 2,000 years later raises intriguing questions. What else was hidden, and why? The Apocalypse of Peter was already known by ancient scholars, such as Clement of Alexandria, who mentioned it as a valid reading. However, it disappeared from public hands, probably during the first centuries of Christianity. When the biblical canon was being formed, this disappearance does not appear to be a coincidence. The message of the text, with its graphic descriptions of hell and the suggestion that even the damned could be forgiven, was too uncomfortable for the official narrative the church was constructing. The discovery of Akhmim's Codex was not just an archaeological find. It was a reminder that early Christianity was much more diverse than the canon suggests. Texts like the Apocalypse of Peter offer a window into a time when different perspectives coexisted and competed for space. However, as the church became institutionalized, it needed a unified narrative that reinforced its authority. Texts that presented complex ideas or contradictions, such as the Apocalypse of Peter, were silently relegated to oblivion. What makes this discovery even more significant is the archaeological context, found alongside other texts that were also excluded from the canon. The Apocalypse of Peter is part of a collection that directly challenges the decisions made by the councils of the early church. These texts reveal a struggle for power and control that is often forgotten in the official history of Christianity. The reemergence of this manuscript brings into focus the role of the church in shaping the spiritual narrative to suit its political and theological interests. Akhmim's discovery not only reignites interest in the Apocalypse of Peter, but also raises questions about what else may be hidden. How many other texts were deliberately suppressed because they did not align with the convenience of the moment? And what could these texts teach us about early Christianity and its internal struggles? If you like this content and want to continue exploring forbidden knowledge and hidden stories of humanity, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Until the next video.